They told her to move the bucket from the middle of the room. In front of everyone, judges, solicitors, reporters, a woman nearly 70 years old gripped the iron handle as though she were gripping her very soul. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew what she was about to reveal. That same woman, ignored for decades, was minutes away from saying something that would silence an entire city. For 30 years, she had lived in silence, believing the past had been buried. But on that cold morning in Galway, when she opened an old brown envelope, what she found inside was capable of reopening wounds that had never healed, and of bringing an entire courthouse to its knees. The sound of the bucket dragging across the marble floor of Galway Courthouse echoed like a confession. Bríd Mawline, 67 years old, widowed, black, her hands marked by soap and cold, mopped the floor beneath the indifferent gaze of judges and barristers. On this particular day, something felt different. The air was thick, footsteps sounded heavier. When the chief judge passed by and, without looking at her, ordered, "Move that bucket, woman," a stifled laugh rippled through the chamber. Brid drew a deep breath, clutching the mop handle as though it were her very dignity. But tucked inside her apron pocket was a brown envelope, handed to her by a stranger the morning before. Before opening it, Brid noticed the old seal, the same kind used in court documents 30 years ago. Inside, just a yellowed sheet and a single sentence in shaky handwriting. "He didn't die by accident." Her heart, long accustomed to surviving in silence, began to pound as if desperate to escape her chest. Brid left the courthouse without asking permission, sat on a bench in Eyre Square, and wept as she hadn't since her son Connell's funeral. That sentence reopened a wound time had merely covered. Who had sent the letter? And what did they want from her, a simple cleaner who only dreamed of peace? The square was busy with its usual rhythm, mothers pushing prams, students rushing to lectures, tourists photographing the brown doorway. But Brid saw none of it. Her vision blurred with tears. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The envelope felt like it weighed 1,000 stones in her trembling hands. She read the line again, and again. He didn't die by accident. Connell, her boy, her only child. The Gardaí had told her it was a mugging gone wrong, a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They'd been so matter-of-fact about it, so clinical. "Sign here, Mrs. Mawline. Initial there. We're terribly sorry for your loss." The file was closed within weeks. She'd been too broken to question it, too lost in grief to fight. But now, 3 decades later, someone was telling her it had all been a lie. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, feeling every crease, every imperfection. Who would know such a thing? Who would wait 30 years to tell her? The handwriting was elderly, shaky. Someone old, perhaps unwell. Someone with a conscience finally breaking through years of silence. A cold wind swept across the square, carrying with it the salt smell of Galway Bay. Brid pulled her gray cardigan tighter around her thin frame. Her knees ached from years of kneeling on cold floors. Her back protested every movement, but none of that mattered now. The physical pain was nothing compared to the agony reopening in her chest. She thought of Connell's face the last time she'd seen him alive. 23 years old, full of fire and dreams. He'd been organizing with the housing activists, fighting for better conditions in the estates where families like theirs struggled. "Ma'am," he'd said, kissing her cheek before heading out that final evening. "Things are going to change." "You'll see." His eyes had sparkled with such hope, such beautiful, naive hope. And then he was gone. Found in an alley off Shop Street, they said. Beaten and left to die. His belongings stolen. Just another sad statistic in a city that sometimes forgot its most vulnerable. Brid had buried her boy in Rahoon Cemetery, standing in the rain whilst a handful of mourners muttered prayers. She'd placed his favorite blue scarf in the coffin with him, the one he'd worn since he was a child, the one that smelled of him even after washing. She'd whispered her goodbyes and walked away, carrying a grief so profound it had hollowed her out completely. She'd stopped living that day. What followed were merely the motions: waking, working, sleeping, surviving. The widow's pension wasn't enough, so she took the cleaning job at the courthouse. It was cruelly ironic, really, spending her days in the building that represented justice whilst her own son's death had received none. But she needed the money, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she lifted her eyes from the letter, she saw a woman standing across the street watching her intently. A woman with striking green eyes, the color of spring grass after rain. Eyes identical to those of Chief Judge Kieran Keary, the man who'd ordered her to move her bucket just an hour before. The woman didn't look away when their gazes met. Instead, she took a step forward, then another, crossing the road with purpose. Brid's heart hammered. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear back into the safety of invisibility she'd inhabited for so long. But something, perhaps the same thing that had kept her son fighting until his last breath, made her stay. The woman stopped a few feet away. Up close, she was younger than Brid had initially thought, perhaps late 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a cream wool coat and carried herself with the careful posture of someone used to being watched, judged. "Mrs. Niemhauerlein," the woman said softly. Her accent was educated, Dublin perhaps, with undertones of somewhere else. "My name is Alana Curie. I know you've just received something." "Something that's changed everything." Brid's mouth went dry. "How do you—" "Because I sent it," Alana interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "And I need you to know. I'm so sorry for what my father did to you." Her name was Alana Curie. She claimed to be a history teacher, but her nervousness betrayed another role entirely. Brid distrusted her immediately. The two met in a small cafe that smelled of fresh bread and sea air, tucked away on one of Galway's narrow side streets where tourists rarely ventured. The kind of place locals used for conversations they didn't want overheard. Alana revealed the reason she'd been following Brid. "I'm Judge Kieran Curie's daughter, and I need your help." Brid's cup rattled against the saucer in her trembling hands. They sat in a corner booth away from the handful of other customers, a pensioner reading the Connaught Tribune, a young mother trying to calm a fussy baby, the owner wiping down the counter with mechanical precision. The radio played softly in the background, some phone-in program about property prices. Normal life, continuing as if Brid's entire world hadn't just fractured. Alana slid a small digital recorder across the scarred wooden table. Her fingers were long and pale, nails bitten short. "Before you listen to this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to understand something. I've lived my whole life knowing my father was a good man, respected, fair, the kind of judge people trusted with their lives, their futures." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong about him." Brid stared at the recorder as if it were a snake coiled to strike. "What's on it?" "The truth," Alana replied simply. "Press play." With shaking fingers, Brid pressed the button. Static crackled, then a voice emerged. Younger than the man she'd heard in court that morning, but unmistakably the same. Judge Kieran Curie, decades ago, his words sharp and businesslike. "The boy died because he needed to die. The Garda made mistakes and we covered them. Too much attention on this case would damage everyone involved. Forget his name. Forget he existed. That's an order, not a suggestion." Another voice, uncertain. But sir, his mother... His mother is nobody, a cleaner. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her. People like that don't ask questions. They're grateful for any help we offer. Now close the file and let's move on. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. Brid felt as though she were underwater, pressure building in her skull, lungs burning for air she couldn't draw. The walls of the cafe seemed to close in, the cheerful yellow paint suddenly garish, obscene. People like that, she whispered. That's what he called me. People like that. Alana's eyes glistened with tears. I found this 6 months ago. I was clearing out my father's study after his stroke. He's retired now, mostly bedridden. There were dozens of these recordings hidden in a locked box. Cases he'd managed. That's what he called it. Managing justice. Brid's hands clenched into fists on the table. 30 years. 30 years of believing it had been an accident, a random tragedy. 30 years of guilt. Had she done something wrong as a mother? Had she failed to protect him somehow? 30 years of a grief so pure and terrible it had consumed everything else in her life. And all along it had been deliberate, calculated. Her son hadn't just died. He'd been erased. Why? The word came out broken, raw. Why did they kill him? Alana shook her head. I don't know the full story yet, but from what I've pieced together, your son was involved in some kind of protest, something to do with housing corruption. He'd discovered irregularities in council contracts, payoffs to developers, people with connections, powerful people. And then he was found dead, and suddenly the investigation into those contracts disappeared too. Convenient, Breed said bitterly. Too convenient. Alana leaned forward. Mrs. Niemhaulein, I know what I'm asking is enormous. But I can't do this alone. I can't take down my own father without help, without proof that extends beyond these recordings. And you're the only person with standing, the only one who can demand the case be reopened. Brid stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The mother with the baby looked over, startled. Brid didn't care. She couldn't breathe in here, couldn't think. She stumbled towards the door, Alana calling after her, but she kept moving out into the gray afternoon, into the drizzle that had started to fall. She walked without direction, past the Spanish Arch, along the River Corrib, towards Clada. Her feet moved on autopilot whilst her mind reeled. For the first time in decades, the idea of justice burned within her. Not revenge. She was too tired for that, too worn down by life. But justice. The truth. Her son's name restored, his memory honored. But the fear was overwhelming. Challenging a powerful judge, even a retired one, meant risking everything. Her job at the courthouse? They'd dismiss her immediately. Her rented flat in Bohermore? The landlord would find an excuse to evict her. Her peace, the fragile equilibrium she'd built to survive, all of it would shatter. Was she strong enough for this fight? At 67, with arthritis in her knees and a pension that barely covered food? What if she tried and failed? What if they destroyed her the way they destroyed Connell? The rain fell harder. She should go home, change into dry clothes, heat some soup. Forget this madness. Let the dead stay buried. But Connell's face appeared in her mind, not as he'd been in the coffin, pale and still, but as he'd been in life, laughing, fighting. Believing that change was possible, that ordinary people could stand against corruption and win. Things are going to change, ma'am. You'll see. Brid turned back towards the city center, towards her small flat. Decision made. She would fight. For Connell. For every other mother whose child had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. When she reached her building, a converted terrace house divided into 6 flats, she noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her door, the one on the ground floor at the back, stood slightly ajar. She always locked it, always checked twice before leaving. Always. Heart pounding, she pushed it open. The small sitting room was in disarray, not ransacked exactly, but searched. Cushions moved, drawers slightly open. And on the kitchen table where she'd left the envelope that morning, carefully placed beside her breakfast dishes, nothing. The letter was gone. Someone had been here. Someone knew she had the evidence. And they'd made sure she understood. They were watching. They could reach her anywhere. She wasn't safe. Brid sank onto her threadbare sofa, the reality of what she'd agreed to crashing over her. This wasn't just about truth or justice anymore. This was dangerous. People had killed to keep these secrets before they could kill again. The Gardaí were evasive, calling it a common burglary. Brid knew better. The drawers remained untouched. Her modest collection of jewelry, her late husband's wedding band, a silver cross from her confirmation, still lay in plain sight on the dresser. Only the envelope had vanished. That evening, the radio announced the critical condition of a former solicitor named Declan O. Tuama, once employed at Galway Courthouse. The name ignited memories. Declan was the man who'd guided Brid through the paperwork after Connell's death. She remembered him clearly now, though she'd tried to forget. A small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a kind smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd been so helpful, so patient with her grief-addled confusion. "Just sign here, Mrs. Nimhaulein. And here. Initial this page. Don't worry yourself about the details, love. We'll take care of everything." She'd trusted him completely. What choice had she had? The news report said he'd collapsed at home, a suspected stroke. Critical but stable. Visiting hours at University Hospital Galway were 2 to 4 and 6 to 8. Brid checked her watch, 5:30. She could make the evening session if she hurried. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and despair, that particular institutional scent that clung to places where life and death conducted their eternal negotiations. Breed navigated the corridors with the familiarity of someone who'd spent too many hours in such places, visiting her husband during his final illness, sitting vigil as he slipped away from her one labored breath at a time. Declan's room was in the cardiac unit, 3rd floor. A nurse at the station told her he'd had no other visitors, which struck Breed as profoundly sad. To reach such an age, to face death, and have nobody come. She almost turned back. What right did she have to intrude on a dying man's solitude? But something pushed her forward. The same instinct that had made her keep that envelope, that had made her meet with Alana despite every rational reason not to. He was awake when she entered, though barely. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, charting a life running down like an old clock. His eyes, still sharp behind those same wire spectacles perched on the bedside table, widened when he recognized her. "Mrs. Nimhaulein," he whispered, his voice like dried leaves. "I wondered if you'd come." "You knew I would?" A ghost of a smile. "Hoped. I've been waiting to tell you. Before." He gestured weakly at the monitors, at his failing body. Breed pulled a chair close to the bed. "Tell me what, Mr. O'Twama?" He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with pain. "The drawer." "Open it, please." She did. Inside the bedside cabinet's single drawer lay cassette tapes. Old ones, the kind nobody used anymore, and a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with cramped handwriting. "Take them," Declan urged. "Everything. Before the nurses, before anyone else. Nobody wanted you to understand what you were signing back then. I helped them do that. God forgive me, I helped them." His eyes filled with tears. "Your boy, Connell. He was a good lad." I met him once, did you know? At a protest outside the courthouse, he was making a speech about corruption in the housing department. Fire in his eyes. Reminded me of myself. Before I chose comfort over conscience. Breed felt her throat constrict. What happened to him? He found evidence. Contracts with forged signatures, bribes disguised as consulting fees. He was going to expose 3 city councilors and a property developer named Marcus Finch. Powerful men, Mrs. Niemhau Line. Men who don't allow themselves to be exposed. Declan coughed, a wet, rattling sound. The guardie who responded to the assault, they were told to mishandle it, to lose evidence, to make it look like a random attack, and then I made you sign away your right to question any of it. The mediation document, Breed breathed. You thought it was for funeral assistance. It wasn't. It was a legal waiver, buried in jargon. You authorized the case to be closed, Mrs. Niemhau Line. They made you complicit in your own son's injustice. The cruelty of it stole her breath. All these years she'd blamed herself for not pushing harder, for accepting the official version, and all along she'd been tricked into enabling it. The tapes, Declan continued urgently. Conversations I recorded, insurance I thought, in case they ever turned on me. Judge Keary, the Garda superintendent, the counselors, all of them discussing how to bury the case. And the notebook has dates, amounts, account numbers, everything you need. Why now? Britt asked. Why did you wait so long? Because I was a coward. The admission was stark, painful. I had a mortgage, a daughter in university, a life I'd built on compromises. I told myself it was just once, just this one case, but it never is it? Once you cross that line. He closed his eyes. I'm dying, Mrs. Niemhau Line. Cancer, they tell me, though the stroke will likely finish me first. I won't face God carrying this secret. It's the only decent thing I can still do. Brid gathered the tapes and notebook into her bag. Her hands shook. Thank you, she managed, for telling me. Don't thank me, Declan replied bitterly. I helped kill your boy as surely as if I'd been in that alley. Just make it mean something, please. Make his death mean something. She left quickly before emotion could overwhelm her. In the corridor, she nearly collided with a doctor, mumbled an apology, kept walking. She needed air, space, time to process what she'd learned. In the hospital car park, under the harsh fluorescent lights, she phoned Alana. I have more. Evidence. We need to meet. They convened at Alana's flat in Salt Hill, a modest place with views of the bay. Books everywhere, history texts, legal volumes, novels stacked in precarious towers. The professor's life, Brid thought. comfortable in its intellectualism, removed from the messy reality of justice denied. But when Alana heard the tapes, her father's voice discussing Connell's death with chilling pragmatism, the superintendent agreeing to lose witness statements, the counselors worried about their exposure, she wept openly. "He needs to answer for this," Alana said fiercely. "Even if he's my father, even if it destroys me, he needs to face what he's done." Brid nodded, though her heart ached for this young woman who'd had her entire understanding of her parent shattered. What must that feel like, to discover your father was a monster? They worked through the night, listening to every tape, cross-referencing dates in the notebook. A picture emerged of systematic corruption, of justice bent and broken to serve the powerful. And at the center of it all, Connell Nimhaulein, a young man who'd threatened to expose it all. At 3 in the morning, they reached the final tape. Declan's voice, recorded recently, weak and urgent. "If anyone hears this, know that the person who truly sealed Connell Nimhaulein's fate was his own mother. Without knowing it, without understanding, she gave them the legal cover they needed. They used her love against her, used her grief as a weapon, and they laughed about it afterwards." The tape ended. Brid sat frozen. Alana reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I killed him," Brid whispered. "I signed those papers and I killed my own son." "No," Alana said firmly. "They killed him. They manipulated you. They lied to you. You were a victim too." But Brid barely heard her. The weight of 30 years crashed down at once. Not just grief now, but guilt. Complicity. Her signature on that document, unwitting though it was, had allowed murderers to walk free. How could she ever forgive herself for that? Brid spent the night poring over the notebook. Amongst the scrawled notes and crossed-out lines, she found a photocopy of an old mediation document, signed by her own hand. The document they'd presented as a funeral assistance authorization was, in truth, a waiver of rights to pursue further investigation. She'd given them everything they needed to bury the case forever. The discovery hit like a physical blow. She stumbled to the small bathroom in Alana's flat and vomited into the toilet, her body rejecting the truth it couldn't digest. The wind from the Atlantic howled through gaps in the window frame, rattling the glass. In the sitting room, the candle Alana had lit beside Connell's photograph, a copy Brid had given her, guttered and went out. For the first time since receiving that envelope, Brid wished she'd never learned the truth. Ignorance had been painful, but at least it had been survivable. This knowledge was poisonous, corrosive. It would eat her alive from the inside out. She collapsed onto the bathroom floor, the cold tiles pressing against her cheek. How many times had she looked at that photograph of Connell and told herself she'd done everything she could? How many times had she absolved herself, reasoning that a mother's love couldn't prevent a random act of violence? All lies. Comfortable lies she'd built to protect herself from a truth she hadn't even known existed. Alana found her there an hour later, still curled on the floor, no longer crying but simply staring at nothing. The younger woman didn't try to move her or offer empty comfort. She simply sat beside her in silence, their backs against the bathtub, two women broken by the sins of men they'd trusted. "I keep thinking," Alana finally said, "about all the times my father tucked me in at night, read me stories, helped with my homework. He was kind to me, Mrs. Neemhouweline." A good father by any measure. And yet he did this. How do those two truths exist in the same person? "I don't know," Breed replied hollowly. "I don't know anything anymore." But even as she spoke, something shifted inside her. A small spark, easily missed, but there nonetheless. Connell's face appeared in her mind again, not sad or accusing, but as he'd been the last time they'd argued. She'd wanted him to stop the activism, to be safe, to live a quiet life. He'd refused. "Ma'am," he'd said, "if everyone who's afraid stays silent, nothing ever changes. Yes, it's risky. Yes, they might come after me. But if I don't fight, who will? If not now, when?" She'd thought him naive then, young and idealistic and foolish, but perhaps he'd been the wise one all along. Perhaps courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Brid pulled herself to her feet, joints protesting, and walked back to the sitting room. The notebook lay open on Alana's coffee table, evidence of decades of corruption spread across its pages. She picked up her mobile phone, a basic model she barely knew how to use, and began typing a message with painful slowness. A letter to the editor of the Connaught Tribune, then to the Irish Times, to RTE, to anyone who might listen. "What are you doing?" Alana asked from the doorway. "What my son would do," Brid replied. "Fighting back." The letter was simple, direct. She identified herself as the mother of Connell Neemhouweline, deceased 30 years ago in what was ruled a random assault. She stated that new evidence had emerged suggesting the case had been deliberately mishandled to protect powerful individuals. She called for the case to be reopened for a public inquiry, for justice delayed but not denied. And she attached her name, her address, her phone number. No hiding, no anonymity. If they wanted to come after her, let them come. She was 67 years old with nothing left to lose except the truth. Alana read the letter over her shoulder. They'll destroy you for this. My father's friends, the people he protected, they're still powerful. They'll attack your credibility, dig into your past, make your life hell. Let them try, Breed said quietly. They already took my son. What else can they take that matters? They sent the letters before dawn, then sat in silence watching the sun rise over Galway Bay. The water was gray and choppy, seabirds wheeling overhead. Somewhere out there, beneath those waves, lay wrecks of ships that had thought themselves unsinkable. The ocean kept its secrets until it chose to reveal them. By noon, Breed's phone was ringing constantly, journalists wanting interviews, radio producers offering airtime. And then the Connaught Tribune itself. They were running the story on the front page of tomorrow's edition. The next morning, Breed walked to the newsagent on Bohermore Road and bought a copy. There she was, front page, an old photograph someone had found from years ago. She looked different then, younger, softer, before grief had carved lines into her face. The headline read, "Retired cleaner challenges former judge over son's cold case." She carried the paper home, hands trembling. This was real now. Irreversible. Within hours, everyone in Galway would know her story. Some would support her. Many would dismiss her as a bitter old woman chasing fantasies. The powerful men she'd named would marshal their defenses, their solicitors, their influence. But she'd done it. She'd spoken. After 30 years of silence, she'd finally used her voice. Brid made herself a cup of tea, sat at her small kitchen table and opened the newspaper to read the full article. It was fair, balanced, presenting both her claims and the inevitable no comment from Judge Keary's solicitor. But it was there, in print, permanent. Truth had a way of surviving, she thought. Even when buried, it eventually clawed its way back to the surface. She was about to close the paper when she noticed a shadow falling across the table. Her body tensed. Someone was standing at her window looking in. The morning sun created a silhouette, making it impossible to see features clearly. Slowly, heart hammering, Brid stood and walked to the door, opened it. Judge Kieran Keary stood on her doorstep, supported by a walking stick, his face haggard but his eyes still sharp. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a black Mercedes with a driver waiting inside. "We need to talk, Mrs. Niemhaulein," he said, his voice rough with age and something else, fear perhaps or desperation. "Before you do something we'll all regret." Brid gripped the doorframe. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to call the gardaí, to run. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped aside. "Come in then," she said. "Let's talk." Breed turned slowly. The man standing in the dim light of her hallway was tall, his face creased with age and shallow breathing betraying his effort. Retired Judge Siren Kiri. He'd come personally. The veins bulging on his hands revealed his tension, and his eyes, once cold and commanding, now trembled like those of a man who knew he was at the end of the line. "I've no idea what you think you'll accomplish, Mrs. Neem Howline," he began, his voice hovering between plea and threat. "I've caused enough suffering already. Don't add yours to my list." Brid maintained her composure. On the kitchen table, the recorder blinked red, capturing everything. She'd learned from Alana, always document, always preserve the evidence. "So you admit it then?" she asked steadily. Kiri's gaze shifted away. "I admit that truth never saves anyone, only destroys, and you won't be able to bear what it still holds." With an abrupt gesture, he placed a weathered folder on the table, bound with string. Inside were documents detailing secret donations, payments made by influential families to close old cases. Amongst them, Connell's name. The room felt airless. Brid's fingers traced the edges of the papers, each one a testament to corruption so deep it had rotted the foundation of justice itself. Property developers, counselors, prominent businessmen, all documented, all complicit. And there, in the middle of it all, her son's file. But something else caught her eye. A receipt bearing the signature of Declan O. Tuama, the solicitor who'd just died. The document confirmed the impossible. The compensation for closing the case had been paid into a bank account opened in her own name, without her knowledge. "They forged my details," she whispered, horror dawning. "They made it look like I was paid off." "Not exactly," Kiri said quietly. "The account was real." "Opened the day after you signed those papers. Someone somewhere thought you might eventually figure things out. This was insurance. If you ever spoke up, they could paint you as a grieving mother who'd taken money and later regretted it. Your word against bank records." The sophistication of the cruelty took her breath away. They'd thought of everything, anticipated every possibility. They'd turned her into a weapon against herself. Kiri lowered himself into a chair uninvited, the walking stick clattering against the floor. He suddenly looked every one of his 72 years. "I didn't come here to threaten you, Mrs. Niemhaulein. I came to warn you. These people, the ones who organized this, they're not all dead or retired. Some are still active, still powerful. You've poked a hornet's nest." "Good," Brid replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Let them come." Let them try to silence me the way they silenced my son. I'm not afraid anymore. You should be, Kiri said, but there was no malice in it. Only weariness. Fear is what keeps us alive. I've been afraid every day since I agreed to bury that case. Afraid of exposure, of losing my reputation, my pension, my daughter's respect. Fear ate me alive from the inside. Is that what you want? What I want, Brid said, her voice breaking slightly, is to look my son in the eye when I die and tell him I tried. That I didn't just accept his murder and move on. That's all. That's everything. Kiri was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew one more document. A single page, folded many times, edges soft with age. He placed it on top of the folder. Before you commit to this path, he said, read that, please. Brid unfolded the paper. It was a witness statement taken the night of Connell's death but never filed officially. A homeless man named Tomas had been sleeping in the alley. He'd seen everything. According to the statement, 2 Gardaí had responded to the assault whilst Connell was still breathing, still conscious. They'd stood over him discussing what to do. One wanted to call an ambulance immediately. The other made a phone call first to someone he called the boss. After that call, they waited. 15 minutes. 20. Whilst Connell bled out on the cold stones. By the time the ambulance was finally called, it was too late. The medical examiner's report would later note that prompt treatment might have saved him. Might have. Brid's hands shook so violently the paper fluttered like a trapped bird. They watched him die, she breathed. They stood there and watched my boy die. Yes, Kiri confirmed. And the homeless man who witnessed it? He disappeared 3 days later. Never seen again. That statement was the only record he ever existed. The room spun. Brid gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. She wanted to scream, to break something, to hurt someone the way she was hurting. But all that came out was a low, animal sound of pure anguish. Now you understand, Kiri said softly, what I meant about truth destroying everything. You can't unknow this, Mrs. Niemauerlein. You can't unsee what you've seen. And if you pursue this, you'll have to testify to it all. You'll have to relive every detail in open court, with journalists recording every word, every tear. You'll become a spectacle. Is that what Connell would have wanted for you? Brid lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. What Connell wanted, she said, voice raw but steady, was justice. He died trying to expose corruption. The least I can do is finish what he started. Kiri nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer. He rose painfully to his feet. Then I can't stop you. Nobody can. But know this, I'll be there when you testify. And I'll tell the truth too. All of it. My part, my shame, everything. My daughter has already informed me she plans to do the same. We'll face this together whether we want to or not. Why? Brid asked. Why confess now after all these years? Because, Kiri replied, his voice barely audible. I'm dying. Cancer, like Declan, seems to be going around amongst those of us who buried our consciences, and I'd rather die despised but honest than respected and damned. He paused at the door. Also, I had a son once too. Different circumstances, but I lost him. To drugs, to despair, to choices I didn't understand. When I see you fighting for Connell's memory, I wonder what it would have been like if I'd fought harder for mine. If I'd been brave instead of careful. After he left, Brid sat alone in her kitchen for hours, the folder and its damning contents spread before her. The afternoon light faded, shadows lengthening across the walls. She should eat something, she knew, should rest, should call Alana and tell her about this bizarre, impossible visit. Instead, she picked up the folded witness statement and read it again and again, memorizing every word, burning it into her mind. This was what her son's final moments had been. Cold stones, pain, the indifferent stars above, and two men in uniform choosing politics over humanity. She would make sure everyone knew. She would stand in court and speak every word of this statement until her voice gave out. She would haunt the people responsible until their dying days. At the bottom of the folder, beneath all the official papers, lay one final note, written in pencil, the handwriting shaky. He didn't die in that alley. Brid's heart stopped. She read it again, certain she'd misunderstood. But no. There it was, clear as day, impossible as it seemed. He didn't die in that alley. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. The world collapsed around Brid. The idea was absurd, too cruel to be a lie. She went to the old Garda station records office and begged for access to the case files. The clerk, a gray-haired man who recognized her from the newspaper, whispered, "The body was never officially identified." There was a fire in the evidence storage on the same day of release. Brid stumbled out into Galway's cold streets, the lights of the docks spinning in the distance like falling stars. Her legs barely carried her. She found herself at Spanish Arch, leaning against the ancient stone, gasping for air that wouldn't come. 30 years. 30 years of grieving, of visiting a grave, of talking to a headstone. And now this. A possibility so terrible and so miraculous she couldn't process it. Had she buried the wrong person? Had she mourned the wrong body? The funeral came back to her in fragments, the closed casket they'd insisted upon. Too damaged, they'd said. Best to remember him as he was. She'd accepted it, too destroyed by grief to question. What mother wants to see her child's broken body? But what if that had been the point? What if they'd needed her not to look, not to ask, not to verify? Her mobile rang. Alana. Mrs. Niemhauerlein, where are you? I found something. Something impossible. They met at a cafe near the cathedral, Breed's hand still trembling. Alana slid a creased envelope across the table, her face pale with shock. I went back to my father's things, found this hidden inside a book, a photo album he kept locked away. Inside the envelope was a photograph, grainy and aged, a soup kitchen, somewhere with shabby walls and fluorescent lighting. A man with a graying beard ladled food into bowls, his profile turned away from the camera. But Brid would know that posture anywhere, the particular way he held his shoulders, the shape of his hands. Dear God, she breathed. It's him. It's Connell. The photo was taken in Limerick, Alana said urgently, at a homeless shelter 7 years ago. 7 years ago, long after the funeral, after the grief had settled into a dull, permanent ache. Her son had been alive, had been living rough on the streets of another city whilst she cleaned floors and talked to his gravestone. Why? The word came out strangled. Why would he do that? Why would he let me think he was dead? I don't know, Alana admitted. But we have to go there. We have to find out. The bus journey to Limerick took 2 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Breed sat pressed against the window, watching the Irish countryside roll past, fields still green despite autumn's approach, old stone walls marking boundaries that had stood for centuries. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more painful than the last. Perhaps Connell had been threatened, forced to disappear to keep her safe. Perhaps the attack had damaged him, changed him, left him unable to come home. Perhaps he'd discovered something so dangerous that staying dead was the only way to survive. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that made her chest ache, perhaps he'd simply chosen to leave, chosen a life away from her, from Galway, from everything they'd been. Perhaps she'd been mourning someone who hadn't wanted to be found. The shelter was in a rough part of Limerick, near the docks where container ships unloaded their cargo. A converted warehouse with peeling paint and a handwritten sign, St. Vincent's Haven, all welcome. Inside smelled of boiled vegetables and unwashed bodies and something else. Desperation, maybe, or simply the particular odor of poverty. The coordinator was a tired-looking woman in her 50s wearing a jumper with holes in the elbows. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," Brid said, producing the photograph. "This man. Do you know him?" The coordinator's face softened with recognition and sadness. "Column. Yes, I knew him. Lovely man. Very gentle. Helped out here for years. Did odd jobs, served food, talked to the newer lads about staying hopeful." She paused. "I'm sorry to tell you, but Column died during the pandemic." Winter of 2020. Pneumonia, we think, though he refused hospital care. Said he'd seen enough of hospitals to last 10 lifetimes. The floor tilted. Alana caught Breed's elbow, steadying her. Did he ever talk about his past? About family?" "Never," the coordinator replied. "That wasn't unusual. Many of our regulars don't. Running from something, most of them. Or someone. Column was private, kept to himself, but kind. Always kind." She hesitated. "There's a box of his things in the storage room. Nobody ever claimed them. You're welcome to look through it if you like." The storage room was barely larger than a closet, shelves lined with cardboard boxes labeled with names and dates. Column's box sat on the bottom shelf, damp-stained and sad. Inside, a few worn clothes, a battered paperback of Joyce's Dubliners, a rosary with half the beads missing, and at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, a small locket. Breed's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, a photograph, faded but unmistakable. Herself, much younger, holding a baby. Connell, not even a year old, looking at the camera with wide, wondering eyes. He'd kept it. Through everything, the attack, the disappearance, the years on the streets, he'd kept this one connection to her, which meant he'd remembered. He'd chosen to stay away, but he'd remembered. Brid sank to the floor, clutching the locket, and wept. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep in her soul. Alana knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Her son had survived that night in the alley. Somehow, against all odds, he'd lived. And then he'd walked away from everything, chosen the streets over home, anonymity over family. For 30 years, she'd grieved a death that hadn't happened, whilst he'd been alive and suffering and alone. Why? Why would he do that? Mrs. Niemhaulein, the coordinator said gently from the doorway. "There's one more thing. Column talked about you once near the end. He was delirious with fever, didn't know what he was saying. But he kept repeating, 'Tell ma'am I'm sorry. Tell her it was the only way to keep her safe.'" The words hit like a punch. Keep her safe. He'd disappeared to protect her. from the people he'd been investigating, from the corruption he'd uncovered from the same forces that would have killed them both if he'd stayed. He'd sacrificed everything, his identity, his family, his future, to save her life. Did he say anything else? Brid asked hoarsely. The coordinator nodded. He said, "She'll understand someday. When it's safe, someone will tell her the truth." And then he gave me this. She handed Brid a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Said if anyone ever came asking about him, showing that photo, to give them this. Brid opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside, a single page in Connell's handwriting, older, shakier than she remembered, but unmistakably his. "Ma'am, if you're reading this, it means you found me, or found what's left of me. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I'm sorry for letting you think I was dead. But they would have killed you too if I'd stayed." The corruption went deeper than I ever imagined, reached higher than I thought possible. Disappearing was the only way. I've lived a different life, helped different people. It's not the life I wanted, but it's been good in its way, and every day I've thought of you. Hoped you were safe. Hoped you'd forgiven me. If you're reading this, it probably means I'm truly gone now. Don't grieve again. I had more years than they meant to give me. Use what you know to finish what I started. Make them answer for everything. You're stronger than you think, ma'am. You always were. I love you. I always loved you. Even from afar. Even in silence. Always. Connell. The letter fell from Brid's fingers. Alana picked it up, read it, tears streaming down her own face. Around them, the shelter continued its work. Volunteers serving dinner, homeless men queuing patiently, the everyday miracle of charity in a broken world. Brid pressed the locket against her chest, feeling her son's presence as clearly as if he stood beside her. He'd been right. She was stronger than she'd known, strong enough to survive his death twice, strong enough to finish his fight. "Take me home," she whispered to Alana. "Back to Galway. We have work to do." News of the open letter and the tapes spread like wildfire. The Department of Justice announced a public hearing at the old Galway courthouse to hear Brid Nimhauline's testimony and review historical cases. She arrived dressed in charcoal gray, hair pulled back neatly, and a pale blue scarf around her neck, the same one Connell had worn as a child, now carefully preserved for 3 decades. The chamber was packed. Journalists, residents, and courthouse staff who'd once laughed at her now whispered her name with something approaching reverence. Brid walked through the heavy oak doors with her head held high, though her knees threatened to give way with each step. The chamber looked different from this perspective, not from the floor with a mop in hand, but walking down the central aisle as a witness, as someone who mattered. The benches were filled with faces she recognized, shopkeepers from Beauharemore, fellow cleaners from other buildings, pensioners from her parish church. People who'd seen her invisible for years now watched her intently. At the front, behind a long table draped in green cloth, sat 3 officials: a high court judge brought in from Dublin to ensure impartiality, a representative from the Department of Justice, and a senior Garda superintendent. To the side, a stenographer prepared to record every word. Cameras lined the back wall, RTE, BBC Northern Ireland, even international news services. This story had touched something raw in the public consciousness. Judge Keary entered, supported by a walking stick, each step labored and painful. Alana accompanied him, one hand hovering near his elbow in case he stumbled. The old man paused at the threshold, his eyes sweeping across the packed chamber. When his gaze met Brid's, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not quite, but understanding. An acknowledgement that they were both prisoners of the past, both seeking some form of redemption. He made his way to the witness area, but before sitting, he stopped at the center of the room. The chamber fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on this man who'd once wielded such power. "This woman," Keary began, his voice rough but carrying clearly, "has more honor than all of us combined. What we destroyed, she rebuilt with truth. What we buried, she unearthed with courage." "I stand here not to defend my actions, but to confess them fully and to beg, not for forgiveness, but for the chance to help make things right." The silence was absolute, heavy as stone. Some in the audience wept openly, others sat rigid with shock. The Dublin judge leaned forward, his expression grave. Brid approached the witness stand, her worn hands gripping the edge for support. She placed the locket on the table, alongside the cassette tapes and Declan's notebook. The physical evidence of decades of corruption, all leading back to one young man who dared to speak truth to power. "I didn't come seeking vengeance," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I came to restore my son's name to the world." Conall Nimhowline was not a random victim. He was murdered because he stood against corruption, and then he was erased, from the records, from justice, from memory. I'm here to say, no more silencing. No more burying truth for convenience. The department representative cleared his throat. Mrs. Niemau-Lein, we've reviewed the evidence you've provided. The tapes, the documents, the witness statements. Based on this material, we are formally reopening the investigation into your son's death. Furthermore, we will be conducting a broader inquiry into case handling procedures during the period in question. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Brid felt only a deep, bone-tired sadness. Justice delayed for 30 years was hardly justice at all, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was truth finally spoken in the open air. Judge Keary took the stand next. His testimony was devastating in its candor, naming names, detailing meetings, explaining exactly how corruption had operated at the highest levels. He implicated counselors, developers, senior gardei. By the time he finished, several people in the audience had fled, no doubt to call solicitors or destroy evidence. I helped create a system, Keary concluded, where the powerful protected each other whilst the vulnerable suffered. Mrs. Niemau-Lein's son threatened to expose us, and we silenced him. Not with our own hands, perhaps, but through negligence that was effectively murder. I will carry that stain until my dying day. Alana testified too, explaining how she'd discovered the recordings, her voice breaking as she described the moment she realized her father was not the man she'd believed him to be. But Mrs. Niemau-Lein showed me, she said, looking directly at Brid, that we can choose differently, that we don't have to perpetuate our parents' sins. We can break the cycle. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, everyone was exhausted, emotionally drained by the weight of so much truth finally spoken. The Dublin judge announced that formal charges would be considered against surviving individuals involved in the case. He also made an unusual announcement. The Department of Justice, in consultation with local community leaders, has decided to offer Mrs. Brid Niemau-Lein a position as Peace Commissioner for County Galway. This role, traditionally held by respected community members, involves facilitating reconciliation, witnessing documents, and serving as a moral authority. Given Mrs. Niemau-Lein's demonstrated integrity and courage, there could be no more appropriate candidate. The chamber erupted in applause. Brid sat frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. From cleaner to commissioner, from invisible to honored. The irony was almost too much to bear. As people began to file out, stopping to shake her hand or murmur words of support, a young man approached hesitantly. He was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark curly hair and gray eyes that seemed familiar somehow. His face was streaked with tears. "Mrs. Niemhaulein," he said, voice shaking, I think I might be your grandson." The world stopped. Brid stared at him, searching his features. Yes, there, in the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes. Connell's face, younger and uncertain but unmistakable. "My name is Fionn O'Callaghan," the young man continued. "I grew up in care, never knowing my parents. But there was a man who used to come to the children's home, bring us food, tell us stories. He said his name was Colum. He said—" Fionn's voice broke. "He said that one day someone would come looking for me, someone who'd call me family." Brid reached out with trembling hands and cupped his face, the way she used to do with Connell when he was small. "You have his eyes," she whispered. "Oh, child, you have his eyes." They stood there in the emptying chamber, grandmother and grandson meeting for the first time, whilst the Atlantic wind howled outside and autumn rain began to fall against the windows. Around them, the machinery of justice creaked back to life, preparing to right old wrongs. But in that moment, none of it mattered as much as this. Family, found again after being lost. The young man's name was Fionn O'Callaghan. He'd grown up in an orphanage in Limerick, raised on stories of a mysterious man who fed him on the streets and said, "One day someone will come to call you family." The DNA test confirmed it. Fionn was Brid's grandson. She embraced him in the courthouse courtyard, the Atlantic wind tossing the blue scarf at her neck. "Now I understand," she whispered. "My son didn't die in vain. He left something for me to care for." They stood there for a long time. This woman who'd lost everything and this young man who'd never had anything to lose. Around them, Galway carried on with its daily business. Students hurrying to lectures, tourists photographing the Claddagh, seabirds crying overhead. But in their embrace, time seemed to pause, allowing space for healing to begin its slow work. Fionn told his story haltingly, over tea in Breed's small flat. He'd been found abandoned as an infant outside a hospital in Limerick. No note, no identification. The nuns had named him Fionn, Fair One, for his pale infant skin. He'd grown up in the system, moving between foster placements and group homes, never quite belonging anywhere. "But Colum," Fionn said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was different. He'd turn up every few weeks with food, warm socks, sometimes books. He never preached or lectured." Just sat with us, the forgotten kids, and made us feel like we mattered. He paused, wiping his eyes. The last time I saw him, he was very ill. Couldn't stop coughing. I wanted to call someone, but he refused. He just said, "Promise me something, lad. When someone comes looking for you, and they will, promise you'll give them a chance. Family finds family, always." Brid's heart broke and mended simultaneously. Connell had known. Somehow, in those final days, he'd known she would discover the truth. He'd prepared this boy, his son, for the moment when past and present would collide. "Did he ever mention why he left?" Brid asked gently. "Why he stayed away?" Fionn nodded. "Once. He said he'd done something brave but dangerous, and the people he'd angered would hurt anyone connected to him. So he chose to disappear, to protect the person he loved most in the world. His mam, he said." "He talked about you sometimes when he thought I wasn't listening properly. Said you were the strongest person he'd ever known." The tears came then, unstoppable. Not grief this time, but something more complex. Sorrow mixed with pride, loss entwined with gratitude. Connell had lived 30 years in exile, homeless and alone, protecting her with his absence. And in those years, he'd found purpose in helping others, in being for forgotten children what he could no longer be for his own son. In the days that followed, Brid visited the cemetery where the unidentified body had been buried 3 decades ago. The plot was unmarked, overgrown with weeds. She knelt on the damp earth and buried the locket there, returning it to the place where she'd first laid her grief to rest. Alana accompanied her in silence. The younger woman had become a constant presence, a bridge between Brid's past and future. "You saved me too," Alana said quietly. "You showed me that courage isn't defying others, it's defying your own fear." "And you showed me," Brid replied, "that the sins of the fathers don't have to become the sins of the children, that we can choose differently." They planted forget-me-nots on the grave, small blue flowers that would bloom each spring. Not for the unknown person buried there, but as a marker of what Brid had believed, what she'd mourned, what she'd survived. Months passed. The investigation continued, slowly grinding through decades of buried corruption. Several former officials were charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Others, like Judge Keary, were too ill to prosecute but gave full testimony, ensuring the historical record was finally corrected. The courthouse underwent its own transformation. A plaque was unveiled at the entrance. Connell Neame Howlion Memorial Chamber for Truth and Human Dignity. Brid attended the ceremony, Fionn at her side, and felt something shift inside her. Not closure. She'd learned that closure was a myth people told themselves, but perhaps acceptance, perhaps peace. As peace commissioner, Brid spent her afternoons listening to residents seeking justice and reconciliation, neighbors in dispute, families torn apart by misunderstanding, individuals struggling against bureaucratic indifference. She offered what she could: a fair hearing, honest counsel, the weight of her hard-won moral authority. The bucket remained in the corner of her flat, no longer a symbol of humiliation, but of strength. Some evenings, when Fionn visited for dinner, she'd tell him stories of his father, the brave, idealistic young man who'd fought for justice even knowing it might cost him everything. "He sounds amazing," Fionn said one evening, helping her wash dishes. "I wish I'd known him properly." "You did," Brid assured him. "The man who fed you, who sat with you, who made you feel you mattered, that was Connell. That was your father, even if you didn't know his real name. He gave you what he could, which was everything that mattered." Fionn had moved in with her, the small flat suddenly feeling less empty. He was studying at university. Social work, he'd decided, wanting to help others the way Colum had helped him. Some nights Brid would wake to find him asleep on the sofa, textbooks scattered around him, and she'd feel a fierce protective love that was both familiar and new. One evening, as autumn turned to winter and the Atlantic storms battered Galway's coast, Brid stood at Salt Hill Promenade watching the waves crash against the shore. The water was wild, furious, eternal. It had been here before her, would be here after her, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But she'd mattered. That was what she'd learned. Even when invisible, even when silenced, even when broken, she'd mattered. Her love for Connell had mattered. His sacrifice had mattered. And now, through Fionn, through the reopened case, through the changed procedures that would protect other families, it all continued to matter. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Alana appeared beside her, collar turned up against the wind. "I was thinking," Brid said, "about judgment." How we're all judged in the end, by history, by each other, by ourselves. But the only judgment that truly matters is whether we had the courage to do right when it was hardest. "And you did," Alana said firmly. "Against impossible odds, against every reason to stay silent, you did." Brid smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "We all did. You, me, your father in his way, even Declan at the end. We're all capable of change, even when we think it's too late." They walked back along the promenade together, two women who'd found each other across a chasm of pain and emerged changed. Behind them, the Atlantic roared its ancient song. Ahead, the lights of Galway glowed warm against the darkness. That night, before sleep, Breed repeated the words that had become her evening prayer. Life judges all of us, but only forgiveness absolves. She thought of Connell, hoped he'd found peace in whatever came after. She thought of Fionn, sleeping in the next room, his breathing steady and calm. She thought of all the families she'd help as peace commissioner, all the small acts of justice she could facilitate. And she thought of the bucket, sitting in its corner, transformed from a symbol of shame to a reminder that dignity could never truly be taken, only temporarily obscured. She'd been invisible, but she'd always been there, always strong, always worthy. The wind rattled her window, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Brid closed her eyes and for the first time in 30 years, slept deeply and without nightmares. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to do good. But tonight, she could rest. She'd finished what Connell started. She'd spoken truth to power. She'd found her grandson and built a family from ruins. She'd transformed from a woman cleaning floors to a woman dispensing justice. Most importantly, she'd learned what her son had tried to teach her all along, that ordinary people, armed with nothing but truth and courage, could change the world. One brave act at a time, one refusal to stay silent, one bucket set down, one voice raised, one story told. And in the telling, in the remembering, in the refusing to let the powerful bury the truth, that was where real justice lived. Not in courtrooms or legal documents, but in the stubborn insistence that every life mattered, every voice deserved hearing, every wrong could be made right if enough people cared to try. Brid smiled in the darkness. Rest well, Connell, she thought. Your work continues. Through me, through Fionn, through everyone who heard this story and chose courage over comfort. The legacy of the Atlantic was this: that tides always turned, that what was buried always resurfaced, that truth, like water, would always find its way through. How many times in life has someone told you that you're nobody, that your place is silence, obedience, the forgotten corner of the room? Breed Nimhauline believed that for decades, until the day she discovered that even without power, without education, without a voice, she could raise truth with her own hands. Her strength didn't come from vengeance. It came from the courage to forgive when everyone expected hatred. And you? If you had the chance to look into the eyes of whoever destroyed your past, what would you do? Would you shout, weep, forgive? Sometimes the truest judgment doesn't happen in a courthouse. It happens within us. Brid proved that the most powerful justice is that which comes from a clear conscience and a heart at peace. If this story touched you, share it. Perhaps someone needs to hear that there's still time to begin again, even after the pain. Like, follow the channel and keep watching, because stories like this remind us that the human soul is still capable of surprising the world.